let's see. I think we said Kurt is next. So Kurt is a faith leader in the local pagan community. There's lots of words to explain it, but I think that probably does the best we need to do. So Kurt, please join us.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is a kind of an old tale, and it is my rendition of a tale that was probably old at the time that the Grimm brothers got it written down. It didn't seem to matter what Gerte did. It was never enough to please her stepmother. She could spend an hour sweeping the floor, and her stepmother could find a mote of dust or a blade of grass and complain that she needed to do it all over again. She could spend all afternoon cooking the evening meal, and her stepmother just complained of indigestion after eating it. And no matter how much time she spent trying to spin flax into thread, her stepmother had negative comments about that too. It was too rough, too coarse, too knotted, and never smooth and glassy enough. Her stepsister, Nettie, was an entirely different sort of thing. For her, the stepmother never had anything but words of praise. If Nettie slept half the day, well, a girl needed to get her rest. If Nettie didn't want to help with any of the household chores, well, a girl needed to keep the softness of her hands then. And if Nettie didn't want to spend her time practicing with the spinning, that's because she had a natural talent for it and really didn't need any more practice. One day, Gerte was out in the yard practicing her spinning because the yard was a much nicer place to be than inside the house. And she was practicing and working with a drop spindle over and over and over again until the thread was pulled so fine that it actually cut into her hand. And she wound up bleeding all over the spindle, and the spindle, now covered with blood, slick with blood, she took it over to the well in order to wash it off, and she lost her grip on it. Into the well it went, down, 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 and she could not see where it had fallen to. And so she ran into the house. But she knew what was going to happen. She had a pretty good suspicion, and sure enough, her stepmother came up to her. "Clumsy, stupid girl! We are not made of money. I will not give you another spindle. You have a perfectly good spindle. Go back out to that well and fetch it." And so Gerte went outside and went up to the edge of the well and looked down within and could not see any way to pull that spindle back up. She couldn't even see it. And so she stepped up on the edge of the well, and she jumped in, following the spindle. And down and down and down she went into the well, down, and somewhere in that fall, she blacked out. And when she awoke, she found herself perfectly dry and laying in a meadow. And as she got up and looked around, she saw beautiful flowers in bloom, smelled the scent that was carried on the breeze, and it was a beautiful place. And she began to walk in this beautiful place. And she heard something off in the distance that sounded like a cry for help, a cry of distress. "Help us, help us." And so, of course, she ran to get closer to that, find out what was going on, see if she could offer any assistance. And she came across a place where there were many, many loaves of bread in a huge oven. And it was the bread loaves themselves that were crying out, "Help us, help us. We have been in the oven for far too long, and surely we will burn." Well, Gerte was no stranger to the kitchen. So she grabbed a baker's peel and she pulled all of those loaves of bread out of the oven and stacked them up on a table and continued on her way. Well, she didn't go much further before she heard another call of distress. "Help us, help us." And this time she looked up and realized that she was standing under an apple tree, and it was the apples themselves that were crying out, "Please shake the tree and release us. We are ripe and we do not want to rot on the branch." Gerte was no stranger to working in the garden, so she shook the tree and the apples came down, and she piled them all up neatly near the base of the tree and continued on her way. Well, next she came up to a cottage, and in front of the cottage there was an old woman, and as Gerte grew closer, the old woman looked up and noticed her, and she smiled at her, and the old woman had huge teeth in her smile, and Gerte was taken aback. She was very frightened, for the only person she knew of that had teeth that large was Frau Holle, and Frau Holle was the one who controlled the wind and the rain and the snow. Potentially scary character. But nonetheless, she stepped closer because Frau Holle gestured her over, and the two of them began to talk. And Frau Holle offered her a deal. Gerte would take care of all of the house cleaning. She would sweep the floors. She would take care of the cooking. She would cook all the meals. And most important, she would take care of Frau Holle's feather bed because it needed to be shaken out every single day. And as that feather bed was shaken out, the feathers gently fell down to the earth, and as they fell, they turned into flakes of snow. And this is what made it snow all over the world. And this was a very important role. And every day Gerte got up and swept the floor, and every afternoon she cooked the dinner, and there was meat in dinner every day. And this is not something that she was used to. And every day she shook out Frau Holle's feather bed and let the snow fall where it may. It was a good arrangement, and Gerte was quite happy with what she was doing, but one day she woke up and she felt a little bit sad. And she didn't know why at first, and then suddenly she realized that she was homesick. She loved working with Frau Holle. She loved where she was staying. She knew it was a much better life than what she had left behind, and yet she knew that her place was back with her stepmother and her stepsister. And so she said this to Frau Holle, and the old woman smiled her toothy smile and said, "I will show you the way to go home." And she took Gerte out into the backyard and showed her where there was a gate with a large archway over the top. And she said, "If you step through that gate, you will find your house very, very quickly. But before you go, there is something of yours that I must give back." And she reached within her cloak and pulled out the very spindle that Gerte had dropped down the well all that time before. Well, Gerte stepped through the gate and under the arch, and as she did so, she was showered with gold and riches, and she looked down at herself, and she looked back at Frau Holle, and Frau Holle said, "This is the reward for your service." Well, Gerte continued, and sure enough, there was her backyard not far away. And as she walked into her backyard, the rooster began to crow, "Cock-a-doodle-doo, our golden girl is home anew." Well, her stepmother and her stepsister came running out, and now they seemed to appreciate her, for she was wealthy now. And they brought her in, and they sat her down, and they had a meal, and they made her tell them every step of her journey and where she had been, and most important, how she had wound up with such wealth. And the stepmother said to Nettie, her own daughter, "It is not fair that Gerte goes out and gets all of this wealth. You should have some of that too. You need to do exactly what she did." Okay, Nettie thinks this is not a bad idea. And so she sets out the next morning and goes down not too far from the well, but she doesn't really want to do any spinning. She doesn't really like to spin. And so she just reaches into a blackberry bush and pricks her finger on a thorn, wipes a little blood on the spindle that her mother has given her, and throws it into the well. Looks over the edge and says, "Here goes nothing." Walks up, and jumps in after it. Down and down and down she goes, and just like her stepsister, she blacks out and wakes up in the meadow. And it is a beautiful day, and the sun is shining, and she begins to walk through the meadow. And she hears a sound, "Help us, help us." And she goes and she looks for the source of the sound, and there are all those loaves of bread in that huge oven. "Take us out, we have been in for far too long, and surely we will burn." And Nettie looks at them and says, "I will not dirty my hands with the likes of you," and she continues and leaves them right where they are. And a little bit later, she hears, "Help us," and she looks up and she sees the apples in the tree over her head. And they say, "Shake the tree and let us fall that we may not rot on the vine." And she's like, "I don't think so. If I do that, some of you are liable to hit me in the head." And she leaves them where they are and continues along. Well, she comes up to the cottage next. And there, sure enough, is the old woman standing out in front, and as she smiles her toothy grin, Nettie doesn't back away because Gerte has warned her about this. And so they strike a similar deal. She goes to work for Frau Holle. And for the first week, things don't go too badly. She sweeps the floor. She cooks the meals. She shakes out the feather bed and allows the feathers to fall to the ground and turn into flakes of snow. But after that week, old habits start to kick back in again. And Nettie decides that she would rather sleep in late. And she decides that sweeping the floor is not exactly something that she really wants to be doing. And she gives up on shaking out that feather bed entirely. And this goes on for a couple of weeks, until one day Frau Holle comes up to her and says, "I think your service here is probably at an end." Well, Nettie, of course, does not gather the tone that Frau Holle says this with, rubs her hands together and says, "Good, now I get my reward. This took long enough." And so out into the yard they go, and Frau Holle shows her the archway, the gate, pulls out the spindle, hands it to her, and says, "Right through that gate, you will find your home once again." And so Nettie walks forward and steps through the gate, and she is showered, not with gold, but with tar. And the tar falls into her hair and on her clothing and on her skin, and she turns back in horror to look at Frau Holle, who says, "This is the just reward for your service." She continues along and she comes up to her own backyard, and there's the rooster once again. "Cock-a-doodle-doo, our dirty girl is home anew." Well, as long as Nettie lived, she never did quite get all of the stain of Frau Holle's tar off of herself. Thank you.